Pope Francis issues a slight alteration to leaders of the Eastern Rite Catholic Church. In a letter released yesterday, the Holy Father introduced an age limit for voting in synods and in the election of major Eastern Rite leaders. Now, retired bishops and patriarchs over the age of 80 will not be able to vote in those meetings. Joining us now from Rome is Dr. Matthew Bunson, EWTN News Executive Editor and D.C. Bureau Chief. Matthew, great to be with you. Can you tell us more about this apostolic letter and what it means?
Well, at first blush, as one looks at this Motu Proprio from Pope Francis, it seems to be very technical. It's sort of in the weeds, as they like to say. What he's actually doing is restricting or limiting the voting ability of those leaders of the Eastern Catholic Churches who are over the age of 80, so bishops and patriarchs. Essentially, what he's doing is removing them from the direct process in the synodal life, the synod of bishops that takes place in many of the Eastern Catholic churches, as well as their ability to vote directly for bishops. It's part of the structure of Eastern Catholic churches as well that exists under a technical term called sui juris. Francis is essentially trying to align the Eastern Catholic churches, as he has done over the last weeks and the last few years, with much of the practice of the Roman Rite, of the Latin Rite. And what that means is that there's a parallel structure now between the Eastern Catholic churches and the Latin Church, or the Roman Church. And in that sense, I think Francis sees this as an important step to make. We already see, for example, that among the College of Cardinals, someone who's over the age of 80 can no longer participate in a conclave. So there are parallels there, but it still has pretty significant ramifications for the daily functioning of the Eastern Catholic churches.
Yeah, and this apostolic letter explains why this change was needed. Can you talk to us more about that?
Yeah, well, as Pope Francis notes in this Motu Proprio, a document that literally means by my own hands, Pope Francis is weighing in on the way that the bishops are elected, the process for sort of the deliberations within the Eastern Catholic churches. One aspect of that I think he's trying to make, one point he's making, is that he was hearing from the various dicasteries that are involved in the Eastern Catholic churches, in particular the dicastery for the Eastern Catholic churches, as well as the leaders of the Eastern Catholic churches spread around the world, remember there are 23 of them, that there were concerns about how involved those who are over the age of 80 have been in the deliberations and elections and other activities of the leadership of the Eastern Catholic churches. Again, Pope Francis is trying to standardize the practice for the Eastern Catholic churches, and again, making that parallel with the Latin Church. We saw something similar just a few weeks ago when Pope Francis also made a number of changes to what's called penal law or criminal law within the Church, changing several of the canons within what's called the Code of Eastern Canons for the Eastern churches. In that sense, then, what he's doing again is trying to synchronize what happens in the West with those that are happening in the Eastern Catholic churches. Pope Francis is practicing here, I think, an important point, as I was saying, of bringing unity in the church through a series of legislative enactments so that there's parallel structures, but also I think what he sees as a sort of equal distribution of authority and rights.
And Dr. Bunson, before I let you go, speaking of this Motu Proprio and the latest ones that have been published recently, what does it tell us about Pope Francis's style of governance?
Well, there's a lot to unpack just with this Motu Proprio, but also how Francis uses Motu Proprios in his governance. Just in the month of April, we've had 4 separate Motu Proprios looking at everything from the life of religious women, again, to the Code of Canon Law as it relates to the Eastern churches, and in particular the way that they function in terms of criminal proceedings or penal systems. But this is also a reflection of, in many ways, how Francis himself governs. Each pope has a very different style of governance. John Paul II had one, Pope Francis has one, Pope Benedict certainly had one. In Pope Francis, what we're seeing with the Motu Proprios is an effort at decentralization, but he's doing so through a series of individual enactments, which is really what a Motu Proprio allows him to do. We have different types of papal documents. A Motu Proprio focuses specifically on certain legal aspects or decrees and enactments, in particular relating to things like Code of Canon Law. Francis likes to use Motu Proprios. If he's bringing to himself many of the decisions that he's making and then acting very deliberately through these decrees. He has had over 60 Motu Proprios in the 10 years that he's been Pope. That's almost double the number that Pope John Paul II issued over his 25 years. And Pope Benedict himself issued barely a dozen in his 8 years. So it tells us something about how Francis likes to govern, but also how quickly he wants to move in solving problems in the life of the Church.
Well, Dr. Bunson, thank you so much, as always, for coming on and explaining all this to us. We appreciate it. God bless you.